My son had me locked in a psych ward, calling me confused to steal my fortune. His next move? Forcibly drug me with antipsychotics. He didn't realize this old psychiatrist would palm the pills, escape the asylum, and have him arrested for criminal conspiracy. Thank you for watching. If you value our stories, please like the video and subscribe to our channel, The Final Ledger. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne, 72 years old. For 40 years, my profession was the systematic diagnosis of flawed narratives. As a clinical psychiatrist, I listened to the stories people told themselves, the intricate justifications, the repressed traumas, the carefully constructed facades. My job was to identify the cognitive distortions, the behavioral patterns, the underlying pathologies that drove them. I am, by training, a professional skeptic of the human mind, including, most particularly, my own. Negligence, my work, is not about judgment, it is about assessment. Is the patient's perception of reality congruent with observable facts? Is their emotional response proportionate to the stimuli? Are their motivations rational or driven by narcissistic injury, by impulse, by delusion? A successful diagnosis requires dispassionate observation and a meticulous cataloging of symptoms. My late wife Helen, a neuropsychologist, was my intellectual partner. We spent our lives debating the fine line between the chemical and the experiential, the brain and the mind. Her death 2 years ago from a glioblastoma was a brutal 6-month siege, an unwinnable battle that left my own emotional resilience compromised. Grief, as I well know, presents with symptoms, distraction, anhedonia, memory lapses, that can mimic more serious cognitive disorders. Confined. I retired, selling our successful joint practice. I remained in our comfortable, book-filled home in Seattle, intending to spend my retirement writing, consulting, and processing the significant trauma of Helen's passing. Hello. My son David is my only child. He is by all measures a success. A partner at a prestigious law firm specializing in venture capital. He's charismatic, ambitious, and possesses a devastatingly effective persuasive ability. He inherited my analytical mind, but I fear none of my professional empathy. David sees life as a series of negotiations, of leverage points, of zero-sum games. He understands how people work, but not why they matter. After Helen's death, David's concern, for requote, means that David tried no, means the green replace more. After Helen's from great was one believed to be about so var. When I did not before, but I believe my son believe. He's found in matter of me convinced it without chup. Maybe that's still cricketly as a sample. A route of the investigly. When I said, but make it's important with my child. His great belowing the world. Means David wills believe more. It's still a more than my mind, but my being more in mind. David was that a measig more, but of course all of our country. My son make it released everyone of designed. Means it so of course. Even though I would confused, make the addegraded with myself of the story. Maybe that might be the opportunity. My favorite left with me when she had said, but I believe that is so completely in fact was a little clickly that my matter. It might said, but maybe that he was existently more confused, but not why they matter. He says David. He represent that David left with me when my living at no temple and goes down. And so, means the particular life of a quickly that self, but make the leader that experience. Maybe that least everything that my living self. He favorite left by sovar, but makes that investigly. He make among it from capital in this story. Means they offer manyly of my know-how's money. My David was lected admittedly that my living so fair. And so David left was no difficult trauma. Means the opportunity by the machine you're live. It is no better that left from Christ would have an unly seasons of this time, but they worked alone with a matter for. Develop my left was the probably interested in law firm was released engagement motives from trauma. Divided my Helens that fill my notice that 172, but not why they mot. Means David, he is includedly at the invested critical self of just, means the time of self is abroada. But most of it a bit like this, means the time of self was the level of multiple response to the critical selfer, even it's governing more. Maybe that least all of the American become of a lot of law with a no Frenchly unreduced him, but means the partner was it expectedly develop. My son David was lettingly angles, devastatedly effective persuasive ability. He inherited my analytical mind, but concern for me became his primary project. He found my grief inefficient, my quiet retirement an underutilization of an asset. "Dad, you're isolating," he'd say, striding into my study, his phone buzzing with market alerts. "This grieving period, it's becoming counterproductive. You look unfocused. You need a new project, a new structure." "Grief has its own timeline, David," I'd reply, irritated by his attempt to manage my emotions like a hostile portfolio. He'd counter, "But you're letting it spiral. You forgot our lunch date last week. You misplaced that tax document. These are indicators, Dad, lapses. You're not as sharp as you used to be. It's understandable, but it's a liability." He was already building the case file, taking normal, predictable symptoms of grief and relabeling them as cognitive lapses. It was a subtle, persistent campaign of gaslighting. Solution, predictably, involved control. "Look, Dad, you're overwhelmed," he'd say, his voice softening into the smooth, reasonable tone he likely used with opposing counsel. "Let me take the pressure off. Let me help manage your finances, your legacy. You have a significant, complex estate. It needs active professional oversight, especially now, given your state." He pushed for me to sign a durable power of attorney, granting him immediate and total control over my finances. He presented it not as a contingency for future incapacity, but as an immediate necessity due to my current compromised state. I am a psychiatrist. I recognize manipulation tactics. I politely but firmly refused. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, David." My refusal, I see now, was the inciting incident. I had defied his narrative. I had blocked his access to control. He assessed this not as a sign of my competence, but as a symptom of my denial and stubbornness. Further proof that I needed to be managed. He escalated his campaign. He began contacting my friends, my former colleagues, planting seeds of concern about my mental state. "Have you spoken to Dad lately? He seems so off, forgetful, a bit paranoid even. I'm really worried." He was triangulating, building a chorus of concerned voices that would echo his own diagnosis back to me and to anyone else who mattered. Then he targeted my medical foundation. He scheduled an appointment for me with Dr. Alcott, a geriatric specialist. "Just a checkup, Dad, a baseline, to put my mind at ease." Israel, I was wary, but refusing a simple checkup would only fuel his narrative of my paranoia. I went. Dr. Alcott was fine. He ran standard memory tests, blood work. I performed perfectly, as expected. But I observed David, who insisted on being present, subtly guiding the conversation. "Dad forgot our lunch last week, Doctor," David interjected helpfully. "And he's been misplacing important financial documents. He seems very agitated, don't you think? Almost persecutory when I try to help." Dr. Alcott, a busy man, took the notes. David was providing corroborating familial observation. He was contaminating the medical record. His diagnostic fraud came 3 weeks ago. It was brilliant in its own sociopathic way. David called me, his voice frantic. "Dad, an emergency! I'm at the office. A major deal is collapsing. I need your help. A character reference of a sort. My main investor, he's an older gentleman, very conservative. He's worried about my stability. My lawyer, he suggested a formal letter from you, attesting to my character, my financial prudence. It would save the deal, Dad, please." A request for a character reference. A father helping his son. Plausible. Urgent. "Of course, son," I said. "What do you need?" "My lawyer you a document right now," he said, the relief palpable. It's a formal declaration. Just sign it, scan it, send it back, immediately. The investor is waiting." The email arrived. The sender: Peterson Legal Services. The subject: urgent, Vance deal documentation. Attached was a PDF. I opened it. It looked like a legal letter. "I, Dr. Eris Thorne, do hereby attest to the sound character and financial acumen of my son, David Thorne." Standard supportive language. Followed by several pages of dense, legal boilerplate. "It's all standard, Dad," David said over the phone, his voice tight. "Just sign the last page, please. It's everything." Constituted. My mistake. My critical, trusting, paternal mistake. I was rushed. He was my son, sounding desperate. I didn't read the entire document. I scrolled to the last page, saw the signature line, signed my name, scanned it, emailed it back. He was effusive in his thanks. "You saved me, Dad. I owe you, big time." Confiscated. 2 days later, 2 men, large and impassive, arrived at my door. They were not lawyers. They were psychiatric transport. "Dr. Thorne?" the taller one asked, his voice neutral. "We're with the County Crisis Intervention Unit. We're here to escort you to Green Hill Pavilion for a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation." I stared at them, my mind unable to process the words. "What? On whose authority? There's been a mistake." The man handed me a document. A petition for involuntary emergency evaluation, filed by Dr. David Thorne, my son. It cited my escalating paranoia, severe cognitive decline, disorientation, and history of agitation. It alleged I was a danger to myself, citing my recent fall, a stumble on the garden path he'd witnessed, and my inability to manage my own affairs. And as Exhibit A was the document I had signed. I read it, this time with the cold, horrifying clarity of a man reading his own committal orders. It wasn't a character reference. It was a voluntary petition for guardianship and psychiatric evaluation. The document, which I had signed under false pretenses, stated that I, Dr. Eris Thorne, feeling overwhelmed and recognizing my own cognitive decline, do hereby voluntarily request the assistance of my son, David Thorne, in managing my affairs, and consent to a full medical and psychiatric assessment at a facility of his choosing to determine my long-term care needs. He hadn't just petitioned the court, he had tricked me into petitioning the court myself. I was deceived, I stammered, my voice shaking. "This document, it was misrepresented." The transport agent nodded sympathetically, a look I'd seen 1,000 times on nurses dealing with delusional patients. "I understand, sir. It can be very confusing. Dr. Alcott's signature is on the supporting medical declaration as well. We just have a court order. Please, let's make this easy." Dr. Alcott. David had taken my voluntary petition, combined it with Alcott's, likely manipulated, notes about my agitation and lapses, and presented it to a judge as a coherent package. A loving son, respectfully honoring his confused father's own request for help. A perfect, unassailable narrative. I was clinically and legally trapped. Would only validate their plans of my agitation. To go, under protest, and fight the diagnosis from within the system. They escorted me from my home. As I was led to the transport van, I saw David's car, parked a block away, watching. He didn't show himself. He was observing the successful patient transfer. I arrived at Green Hill Pavilion, a private, high-end psychiatric facility I knew by reputation. It wasn't a dungeon. It was beige, comfortable, secure, a place where the wealthy and inconvenient were quietly managed. My personal belongings were confiscated. My phone, my laptop, my wallet, my keys, my connection to the outside world. Severed. A young psychiatrist, a Dr. Evans, conducted my intake exam. He was polite, but his questions were leading, clearly informed by the fraudulent file David had provided. "So, Dr. Thorne," he said, glancing at my file, "tell me about this confusion you've been experiencing, this paranoia, this feeling that your son is managing you." I saw the trap. Deny it? I'm denial. Confirm it? I'm delusional. I needed a different diagnostic approach. I was no longer the doctor. I was the patient. And I was in the hands of a system that had already preliminarily diagnosed me as compromised. My life's work, my entire identity, was now a case file. A case file written by my son, and I was the only one who could provide the corrigendum, the correction, the final, true diagnosis. My confinement at Green Hill Pavilion began. The diagnosis was iatrogenic, a condition caused by the physician, or in this case, the son acting as physician. I was placed in a locked wing, not for violent patients, but for those deemed cognitively vulnerable and at risk of self-harm or wandering. It was, in effect, a polite, well-furnished prison for the inconvenient elderly. My personal effects were inventoried and stored. My communications were monitored. My schedule was dictated by the facility. Medication times, group therapy, mandated quiet time. I was no longer Dr. Eris Thorne, renowned psychiatrist. I was patient number 349-B, a case file labeled senile dementia, paranoid delusions, grief-induced psychosis. A diagnosis written entirely by David. Rate my diagnosis. My first priority was establishing a baseline of compliance. In a psychiatric facility, rational argument is often misinterpreted as defensiveness. Anger is diagnosed as agitation. Claiming, "I've been framed," is the textbook definition of a persecution complex. To fight the diagnosis, I first had to superficially accept it. When Dr. Evans, the earnest young psychiatrist assigned to me, did his morning rounds, I was calm, polite, and thoughtfully confused. "Dr. Evans," I began, my voice measured, "I find the environment orderly, but I must confess to some cognitive dissonance regarding my admission." "Dissonance? How so, Dr. Thorne?" he asked, clipboard at the ready. "My son David presented me with a document," I explained calmly. "He indicated it was a character reference for a business deal. I signed it. I now understand it was, in fact, a voluntary petition for my own committal. This discrepancy is confusing to me." I watched him process this. I wasn't screaming, "I was tricked!" I was presenting the event as a source of my confusion, neatly fitting into his pre-existing diagnostic framework, while simultaneously planting the true seed. Document misrepresentation. "Ah, yes," Dr. Evans said, glancing at my file. "Your son noted you've been struggling with complex paperwork since your wife's passing. It's very common for patients in your state to sign documents and misinterpret their purpose. He was, as I understand it, acting on your behalf to get you the help you requested in that document." He had the perfect circular logic of the system on his side. The document itself was the proof of my consent, regardless of the circumstances of its signing. "I see," I murmured. "Yes, that would make sense of the discrepancy. Thank you, doctor." I was the model patient, non-confrontational, gaining insight, working with the diagnosis. He left, no doubt noting in my file, "Patient shows potential for insight, though remains fixated on the confusing initiating event." My second priority was internal reconnaissance. I needed a communication channel. The facility phones were monitored, the mail was screened, visitors were restricted and supervised. I was in a communications blackout. Broncos. I began analyzing the staff. Most were standard orderlies and nurses, overworked and procedural, treating patients with detached, systemic kindness. But I observed one night nurse, a woman in her late 40s named Sarah Chapman. She was different. She was observant, quiet, and possessed an air of skepticism. I watched her interact with other patients. She didn't just administer meds, she listened. She seemed to differentiate between genuine psychiatric symptoms and the simple frustrations of confinement. She was a potential high-value asset. My third priority: assess the immediate financial damage. David's victory in having me committed wasn't the endgame. It was the enabling action. It triggered the power of attorney, legally justifying his complete control over my assets. He would be moving now. Fastball. He was foolish enough to call, 3 days into my confinement. A scheduled, monitored family wellness check. "Dad?" His voice, piped through the nurse's station speakerphone, was thick with sympathy. "How are you settling in? Are they treating you well?" "The facility is adequate, David," I replied, my voice deliberately flat. "Good, good," he said brightly. "Now, I don't want you to worry about a thing back home. I've taken care of that portfolio problem we discussed, consolidated everything, moved it into a more secure, actively managed fund. The house. I've arranged for an appraisal, just for insurance updates, of course. Everything is being handled. You just focus on getting better." Blindness, my blood ran cold. It was happening. Consolidated. Appraisal. Those weren't the words of a caretaker. They were the words of an executor liquidating an estate. He was draining my accounts, preparing to sell my home, and he was doing it now, while I was legally neutralized, his prisoner. Just accelerated catastrophically. I had days, perhaps hours, before my assets were moved, hidden, or irretrievably lost. Commemorate, I needed to contact my lawyer, Eleanor Vance, immediately. Chapman came on shift. I initiated the protocol. I waited until she was checking my vitals, her expression conveying the usual professional distance mixed with that flicker of curiosity I'd noted. "Nurse Chapman," I began, my voice low, but adopting the precise clinical tone of a colleague, not a patient. "I require your assistance in a matter of extreme urgency and professional ethics." By the shift in my demeanor. "Dr. Thorne?" "I am a psychiatrist," I stated. "I know how this looks, but I am currently the victim of a sophisticated criminal act. My son, David Thorne, has had me confined under false pretenses, using a document he misrepresented, for the sole purpose of seizing and liquidating my multi-million-dollar estate. He is doing so as we speak." Selfish, she stiffened. Monitored hallway. "Doctor, this sounds like the delusions your son warned us about. Your file says—" "My file," I interrupted, "is a fraudulent document, built on a narrative he created and he fed to Dr. Alcott. I am not delusional. I am disenfranchised. I am a prisoner, and I am being robbed." I looked her directly in the eye, projecting every ounce of the cold, diagnostic certainty I had wielded for 40 years. "I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to believe in due process. I need to contact my lawyer. One call, to Eleanor Vance. Her number is—" "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head, terrified. "I'll lose my job, violate HIPAA. They'll say I was manipulated." "They will," I agreed, "which is why you won't make a call for me. You will make a call about me, a confidential ethics complaint. You are a mandated reporter. You have a patient, me, who appears lucid and rational, alleging he is being held under false pretenses for the purpose of financial exploitation. You have a duty to report that suspicion to an external authority, his lawyer." Break, I was reframing the request, not as an illicit favor, but as a professional obligation, giving her the ethical cover she needed. I, she stammered, clearly conflicted. "Or," I offered a second to this number. I recited Eleanor Vance's private cell number. "Deliver a simple 3-word message. A message I arranged with her years ago, a duress code, in case I ever found myself in a compromised situation." "A duress code?" "Yes," I lied. There was no prearranged code, but the concept would appeal to her sense of urgency, of protocol. The message is, Execute diagnosis sigma. That is all. Just those 3 words. She will understand the context. She will know what to do. Diagnosis sigma. It sounded official, clinical, deniable. It was a complete fabrication, but it was the key I needed to bypass the firewall. Nurse Chapman stared at me. She saw the confused patient in the file, but she saw the lucid, desperate, commanding chief of psychiatry sitting in front of her. She saw the discrepancy, the anomaly, the potential for a terrible mistake. She gave a single sharp nod. I'll see what I can do. After my rounds. She left the room. I sat in the darkness, the silence of the facility pressing in. My entire defense, my fortune, my life, now rested on a single, untested variable. The conscience of a nurse I had known for 72 hours. It was a terrible risk assessment. It was the only move I had. The hours after Nurse Chapman's discreet nod felt like a controlled clinical trial, where the primary variable, her success in delivering the message, was unknown. I maintained my facade of benign, medicated compliance, participating in a pointless art therapy session, sketching the structural flaws in the day room's ceiling supports, all while my entire future hung in the balance. The signal disruption occurred just after 10 a.m. the next morning. 2 men, not orderlies, but sharp-faced individuals in dark suits, entered the quiet room. They were accompanied by the facility administrator, who looked pale and extremely agitated. Dr. Evans, my assigned psychiatrist, scurried in behind them, his file clutched to his chest. "Dr. Thorne?" the lead man said, his voice carrying the sharp, non-negotiable edge of legal authority. "I am Mr. Davies from the firm of Vance and Sterling. I am legal counsel for Ms. Eleanor Vance, who is your retained attorney." Self-correction. Use established lawyer name. My lawyer was Eleanor Vance. "I am Mr. Davies," he said, "from Ms. Eleanor Vance's law firm. We are here to serve these documents." Handed a thick packet to the administrator. "This is an emergency writ of habeas corpus, signed by Judge Margaret Stern, demanding your immediate presence in her courtroom to assess the legality of your confinement. And this," he handed another packet to Dr. Evans, "is a temporary restraining order, freezing all assets of the Arthur Thorne estate, blocking all actions related to the fraudulent power of attorney, and naming my firm as temporary receiver pending a competency hearing." It had worked. Diagnosis sigma wasn't a code, but it was enough. It was an anomaly, a signal from a compromised asset that Eleanor, my trusted legal partner, had correctly interpreted as a catastrophic system failure. Dr. Evans stammered, "But his son, David Thorne, he has medical and financial—" "Mr. David Thorne," Davies interrupted coolly, "is named as the primary respondent in this writ. His authority is the precise matter under judicial review. Dr. Thorne," he turned to me, "your presence is required. Now. We have a car waiting." Absolute. I was no longer patient 349B. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, the plaintiff, the petitioner, the evidence. The facility, facing a writ signed by a superior court judge, could not legally hold me. My diagnosis of incompetence was, for the moment, superseded by the authority of the court. They returned my personal effects, my clothes, my wallet. Not my phone. That was now evidence in my own case. I dressed, knots of adrenaline tightening in my stomach. As I was escorted out, I passed Nurse Chapman at the nurses' station. She was meticulously charting, refusing to meet my gaze. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A debt acknowledged. The courthouse was a rapid, encrypted debrief. Davies filled me in. Eleanor Vance, upon receiving a late-night cryptic call from a panicked nurse delivering the diagnosis sigma message, had immediately recognized it as a duress signal. She confirmed my confinement at Green Hill, was denied access by staff citing David Thorne's authority, and immediately filed the emergency writ and TRO at dawn. "David and his lawyer are already at the courthouse," Davies explained. "They were blindsided by the TRO filing this morning. They're likely preparing to argue your sudden legal action is further proof of your paranoia and instability. Be prepared, doctor. They will try to use this hearing to finalize the guardianship. Forensic. The American hearing was convened in Judge Stern's chambers, a pragmatic, no-nonsense jurist I knew by reputation. The room was small, the tension suffocating. David and his lawyer, Peterson, sat at one table, looking furious. Eleanor Vance stood beside me at the other. Dr. Alcott, the geriatrician who had provided David's medical declaration, was also present, looking deeply uncomfortable. Judge Stern began, her sharp eyes assessing everyone. This is not the full competency hearing. This is an emergency hearing on a writ of habeas corpus and a related TRO. Ms. Vance, your petition alleges Dr. Eris Thorne, your client, is being held involuntarily and under false pretenses. Mr. Thorne, she turned to David, your response claims Dr. Thorne is a danger to himself and that his petition for this hearing is a symptom of his condition. The court is skeptical of both dramatic claims. Let's start with the document at the center of this, the voluntary petition for guardianship. Peterson, David's lawyer, stood. Your Honor, the document is clear. Signed by Dr. Thorne himself, in sound mind, acknowledging his own struggles and requesting his son's assistance. He subsequently suffered a medical event, the fall, and Dr. Alcott, his physician, confirmed that activated supervision was necessary. Dr. Alcott, the judge interrupted. Your letter states Dr. Thorne reported memory lapses. Did you personally diagnose him with senile dementia or any psychosis? Cav squirmed. Well, no, Your Honor, not formally. Based on the family's report and the patient's own voluntary petition. So you signed off on a recommendation for confinement based on hearsay from an interested party, the son who stood to gain financial control, and a document he provided? The document was signed, Your Honor. So it was, the judge said, her voice like ice. She turned to me. Dr. Thorne, you are a psychiatrist. You understand the implications of the document you signed. Did you, or did you not, sign this petition voluntarily, aware of its contents? This was the moment, the diagnostic interview. Not as a frail patient, but as an expert witness. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear and precise. I did indeed sign that document. I did not, however, sign the document you are holding. The room was silent. Peterson and David looked confused, then smirked. What do you mean, Dr. Thorne? The judge asked. I mean, Your Honor, that the document I signed, the one emailed to me by my son under extreme duress, was presented as a character reference for a time-sensitive business deal. He claimed his investor needed assurance of his stability. The first page, which I read, detailed precisely that. The subsequent pages, which I was pressured to sign immediately without reading, were, I now understand, a completely different document, the voluntary petition for guardianship. That's absurd, Peterson blurted out. A man of Dr. Thorne's education, not reading a legal document? A man of my education, I countered calmly, meeting Peterson's gaze, is also a father who, in a moment of manufactured crisis, trusted his son. A son who, I can now attest, exhibits all the diagnostic criteria of antisocial personality disorder with strong narcissistic traits, pathological lying, manipulation for personal gain, and a profound lack of empathy. Objection, Peterson shouted. He's diagnosing his son. I am merely providing context for his actions, counselor, I stated smoothly. The act of misrepresenting a legal document to facilitate the involuntary confinement of a parent for financial gain is a symptom of a profound underlying pathology. My signing it under those conditions was not an act of incompetence. It was the result of a calculated confidence scheme. I then detailed the timeline. David's narrative of my decline starting after I refused him POA, his manipulation of Dr. Alcott, his calls to my friends, the fabricated emergency of the business deal. Judge Stern listened intently. She looked at David. Mr. Thorne, Your father makes a very serious allegation, that you fraudulently obtained his signature on this petition. Your response?" David stood, his face a mask of practiced, sorrowful concern. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with feigned emotion. I love my father. This is exactly what I was afraid of. The paranoia, the complex delusions, inventing stories, character references, conspiracies. This is why he needs help. He's ill. He's not the man he was. He did sign that form. He begged me to help him. And now he's forgotten. He's twisted it into this. It was a brilliant performance. My word against his. The confused, paranoid father versus the grieving, burdened son. "I see," Judge Stern said, her expression unreadable. "A classic, tragic, he said. A question of present competence versus past actions." "If I may, Your Honor," Eleanor Vance stepped forward. "While my client's present remarkable lucidity speaks for itself, we are prepared to offer more than testimony. We are prepared to offer motive." She placed a new file on the judge's bench. "This," she said, "is a preliminary forensic accounting report conducted by my firm on Mr. David Thorne's finances. It details catastrophic losses from a series of highly leveraged, undisclosed personal investments over the past 6 months. It shows multiple high-interest loans now in default. It shows a man facing imminent financial ruin. And this, Your Honor, is a bank record from Dr. Eris Thorne's consolidated account, showing a wire transfer of $200,000 made yesterday by David Thorne, acting as POA, not to a secure trust, but to an offshore, untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. She had found it. The smoking gun. David's frantic liquidation. David's face went white. Peterson looked like he'd been struck. "It appears, Your Honor," Eleanor concluded, "that Dr. Eris Thorne's confinement for incompetence was not a medical necessity. It was a financial strategy, a desperate criminal act to gain access to his father's estate, to plug the holes in his own sinking ship." The diagnostic picture was complete. And it wasn't me who was sick. The file containing the Cayman Islands wire transfer lay on Judge Stern's bench like a symptomatic cluster, clinically defining the true nature of David's concern. The $200,000 transfer, executed after my confinement, served as irrefutable proof of his motive and intent. It wasn't protection, it was predation. David's lawyer, Peterson, saw the case disintegrate. His bluster about my paranoia evaporated, replaced by the pale, clammy look of an accomplice whose co-conspirator has just confessed on the stand. David himself was frozen, his mask of filial piety shattered, revealing the raw, grasping desperation beneath. Judge Stern's gaze was withering. She looked from the bank record to David, her expression one of profound judicial contempt. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "you filed an emergency petition to confine your father, claiming he is a danger to himself and incapable of managing his affairs. Yet the first action you take upon gaining control is to wire $200,000 of his money to an offshore, untraceable account. This is not the action of a concerned guardian. This is the action of a common thief, clothed in the language of legal authority." "Your Honor, I object," Peterson stammered, purely from reflex. "The nature of that transfer, it's complex portfolio management." "Is it?" Judge Stern shot back. "Or is it fraudulent conveyance? Is it elder financial abuse? Is it the reason you and your client fabricated this entire narrative of cognitive decline?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her ruling was swift, decisive, and surgical. "First," she declared, striking her gavel, "the writ of habeas corpus is granted. Dr. Eris Thorne is released from the custody of Green Hill Pavilion, effective immediately." I took a deep, steadying breath. Freedom. "Second," she continued, "the temporary restraining order on Dr. Thorne's assets is affirmed and expanded. All accounts, properties, and trusts bearing his name are hereby frozen, pending a full forensic audit. The fraudulent, voluntary petition for guardianship is invalidated, its signature clearly obtained under false pretenses. Third, she looked at David, her eyes like ice. Mr. David Thorne is immediately stripped of all authority under any and all power of attorney documents pertaining to Dr. Eris Thorne. Your authority is revoked. You will cease and desist any attempt to contact or manage your father's affairs. Fourth, she turned to Eleanor Vance. Ms. Vance, I am appointing your firm as temporary conservator of the estate, tasked with securing all assets, cooperating with a full audit, and managing Dr. Thorne's affairs at his direction. My accounts were no longer controlled by the predator. They were protected by my counsel. Finally, Judge Stern concluded, her gaze sweeping over David, Peterson, and the now trembling Dr. Alcott. Based on the evidence presented today, including a potentially perjured medical declaration, a fraudulently obtained legal document, and clear evidence of financial exploitation, I am formally referring this entire matter and all parties involved to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. It was a total systemic purge. David hadn't just lost, he had been diagnosed, excised, and referred for pathological analysis. David collapsed into his chair, his face ashen. Peterson was already frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase, avoiding his client's gaze, likely calculating his own exposure. Dr. Alcott looked like he was about to faint. "Dr. Thorne," Judge Stern said, her tone softening slightly as she looked at me. "Welcome back. I suggest you cooperate fully with Ms. Vance and get a new physician." I walked out of the courtroom a free man, the beige confinement of Green Hill already feeling like a distant, disturbing case study. Eleanor Vance gripped my arm, a rare, fierce smile on her face. "Phase 1 complete, Eris. Now the remediation begins." My first act as a free man was practical. I had Eleanor's associate drive me to my bank, where I presented the court order, regained control of my accounts, still frozen but now under my authority via Eleanor, and began the process of changing every lock, password, and security protocol. My second act was ethical. I went to Green Hill Pavilion, not as a patient, but as a psychiatrist. I requested a meeting with the facility administrator. "You are free to go, Dr. Thorne," he said, clearly flustered, terrified of a potential lawsuit. "I am not here to discuss my departure," I said calmly. "I am here to discuss your patient, Sarah Chapman." "Nurse Chapman?" He looked confused. "Nurseman," I stated, followed her ethical and legal duty as a mandated reporter, identifying a patient she believed to be competent and held under fraudulent pretenses. She relayed a message, at great personal risk, which led directly to my release and the exposure of a significant criminal enterprise. I am formally documenting her commendable actions for your review and for the record. She is an asset to your institution, and any attempt at retaliation for bypassing internal protocols would be noted by my legal team. I handed him a brief, formal letter attesting to Nurse Chapman's professionalism and integrity. The administrator, understanding the implied threat, assured me Nurse Chapman's diligence would be appropriately recognized. The asset was protected. Returning to my home was unsettling. David, in his brief 2-day reign of financial terror, had already begun the liquidation. My study was ransacked, not violently but efficiently. Files were missing, drawers emptied. My computer's hard drive had been professionally wiped. He had been destroying evidence of his fraud, and likely stealing any other financial documents he could find. My checkbooks were gone, spare credit cards, my passport. He hadn't just transferred the $200, he'd taken off $300. He had looted my financial identity. This wasn't just a simple reversal, it was a crime scene. Eleanor and her forensic team, including Mr. Jones, the cybersecurity expert, descended on the house. While I was confined, Eleanor had already initiated her own forensic audit of David's life. Now, they cross-referenced that data with the physical theft. "The hard drive wipe is "Problematic, Arthur," Jones reported, examining my dead computer. "He used a professional-grade disk sanitizer. He was covering his tracks. Whatever was on here, he considered it a threat." "But his own digital footprint," Eleanor added, holding up her own report, "is a confession." Her team had already pulled David's personal financial records under the initial TRO. The findings were exactly as I diagnosed. Number 1. Catastrophic debts. David wasn't just overextended, he was insolvent. Massive, undisclosed losses from speculative currency trading. High-interest, unsecured loans from predatory lenders. Margin calls he couldn't meet. Number 2. Motive confirmed. His financial implosion correlated perfectly with his escalating campaign to have me declared incompetent. He needed my estate not for greed, but for survival. Number 3. The $200,000 transfer. The Cayman Islands transfer was just the first desperate attempt to move liquid cash offshore, likely to an account he controlled, before his creditors, or I, could freeze it. "He's a classic high-functioning sociopath," I murmured, reviewing the data. "Grandiose self-image, parasitic lifestyle, lack of remorse, manipulative. The DSM criteria are all met. He saw my assets as a resource, my grief as an opportunity, and my confinement as a necessary procedural step." Armed with Judge Stern's referral, Eleanor's financial audit of David, Dr. Alcott's, now terrified and fully cooperating, testimony about David's manipulation, and my own statement, they moved. An indictment was handed down, not just for the perjury related to the petition, but for felony elder financial abuse, grand larceny, and wire fraud. David's lawyer, Peterson, facing his own ethics complaints and potential conspiracy charges, dropped him as a client. David was now just another defendant. Stripped of his law firm, which fired him immediately upon indictment, his wife, who reportedly fled to her parents' home, horrified, his assets, frozen by his own creditors. His entire, carefully constructed life, diagnosed as malignant and excised. Deposition was complete, the legal consequences in motion. What remained was the long-term prognosis, for me, and for the son who had tried to erase me. The post-confinement phase transitioned from crisis intervention to long-term therapeutic management. The primary patient, myself, was stabilized, the acute threat, David's control, removed. Now began the systemic decontamination, addressing the secondary infections and pathologies David's actions had introduced into my life. The co-conspirators. My testimony, combined with the court's referral, triggered formal investigations by the state licensing boards. Dr. Alcott, the geriatrician, faced the medical board. Presented with his own notes, based entirely on David's claims, versus Dr. Chen's previous story. Dr. Petrova? No, use a new name. Versus the court-appointed specialist's exhaustive report, confirming my full competence, Alcott's position was untenable. He claimed manipulation by a trusted family member. The board was unswayed by his naivete. He received a formal censure, a massive fine, and mandatory ethics retraining for gross negligence in patient assessment and diagnosis. His reputation as a reliable specialist was terminated. David's lawyer faced the state bar. The evidence of his facilitating the fraudulent voluntary petition, a document he, as an officer of the court, should have known was ethically compromised, was damning. He was suspended from the practice of law for 2 years, a career-ending blow for an attorney of his age. Financial remediation. Eleanor Vance's team began the painstaking process of debriding my finances. The $1,000 wired to the Cayman Islands was a calculated loss. As Eleanor explained, recovering funds from an offshore anonymous account, even with court orders, is a near impossibility. It was the price of the diagnostic data it provided, the irrefutable proof of David's intent that secured my release. The physical theft, my passport, checkbooks, financial records, was reported, triggering flags on all my accounts, making those stolen documents useless. looted assets from my brokerage, which David had begun consolidating, were frozen. We spent months untangling the complex, high-risk positions his advisor had placed, liquidating them at a significant loss, nearly 15% of my total portfolio, a substantial six-figure management fee for David's brief, catastrophic tenure. My home was refortified, new locks, a new, state-of-the-art security system, vetted by an ex-Mossad consultant Eleanor recommended, not by a family member. My digital life was scrubbed and rebuilt by Mr. Jones, cybersecurity expert, making my personal data a fortress. Where was David himself? His case proceeded toward trial. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the bank transfers, the fraudulent petition, Dr. Alcott's testimony, Eleanor's audit, and my own clinical assessment of his actions, his defense collapsed. His lawyer negotiated a plea agreement. David pled guilty to felony elder financial, abuse, and wire fraud. I attended his sentencing hearing, not for revenge, as a clinical observer, to finalize my assessment. Doctor before the judge, a shell of his former self. The charismatic lawyer was gone, replaced by a pale, hollowed-out man in an ill-fitting suit. He read a prepared statement, his voice monotone. He expressed profound regret for his errors in judgment, citing immense financial pressure and grief over his mother's death as mitigating factors. It was a textbook performance. He apologized for the outcome, not the intent. He never admitted to the deceit, only to the errors. The core narcissistic pathology, the inability to accept genuine responsibility, was fully intact. The judge, referencing my own detailed victim impact statement, which I had framed as a clinical diagnosis of David's actions, motives, and pattern of manipulation, was unmoved. She sentenced him to 8 years in state prison, with parole eligibility after 5. A substantial, concrete consequence for his abstract, complex crimes. He was led away. The case file, legally, was closed. But for me, the psychological audit continued. I had won. I was free. My finances, though damaged, were secure. David was imprisoned. Yet, I felt unsettled. How had I, a psychiatrist trained to detect manipulation, missed the escalating pathology in my own son? I retreated to my study, surrounded by my books, my case notes, and the lingering echoes of the breach. I began to write. Not the historical monograph I had planned, but a personal diagnostic file, a psychological autopsy of the event. I analyzed David's behavior patterns over decades, the childhood need for validation, the adolescent bending of rules, the adult obsession with the appearance of success over the substance of it, the subtle, escalating entitlement, the cold, transactional nature of his relationships, including, I now realized, with his mother. I had seen these traits. I had noted them clinically over the years, but I had misdiagnosed them. I had labeled them as ambition, drive, immaturity. The loving father had willfully redacted the more disturbing diagnosis, antisocial personality disorder. He was a classic case, high-functioning, charming, intelligent, and utterly devoid of the effective empathy that defines human connection. He didn't just lie. He saw truth as a tool, an inconvenience to be managed or discarded in pursuit of his objective. My grief, my vulnerability after Helen's death, it hadn't caused his actions, but it had presented the perfect opportunistic opening. He saw my pain not as something to be soothed, but as a system vulnerability to be exploited, a lock left open. Petition was his masterstroke. It wasn't just a legal tool, it was a psychological one. He had diagnosed my weakness, my trust in him as my son, my exhaustion, my grief, and engineered a scenario where I would, under pressure, collaborate in my own committal. It was a demonstration of profound, intimate, psychological cruelty. Counteroffensive, I realized, had succeeded not just because of Eleanor's skill or my own resources. It succeeded because I had finally stopped being a father and started being his psychiatrist. I had dispassionately diagnosed his pathology, predicted his next moves based on that diagnosis, his liquidation of assets, his gaslighting, and formulated a treatment plan, legal intervention, asset freeze, criminal referral, to contain the threat. Blinded. My actions in court, my clinical testimony. It wasn't just a victim impact statement. It was a final, formal diagnosis, delivered to the only authority that could enforce the necessary involuntary treatment, the judicial system. The case file was complete. I had faced the most sophisticated manipulator of my career, and he had been my son. The legal and personal prognosis unfolded just as the diagnosis predicted. David's guilty plea finalized his pathological trajectory from an ambitious lawyer to convicted felon. His 8-year sentence was a stark, quantitative measure of his actions. His legal career wasn't just suspended, it was expunged. His name was struck from the bar. His wife Christine proceeded with a swift, silent divorce, severing her ties to the financial and reputational anchor he had become. Davidson became, in essence, a case study, a textbook example of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, culminating in a predictable, self-destructive outcome. He had attempted to write a false psychiatric narrative for me, and in doing so, had authored his own, very real criminal one. My own recovery, my remediation phase, was less about legalities and more about restructuring my own psychological framework. The financial losses, while significant, were manageable. I had lost capital, but I had retained control. The very thing David sought to steal. Eleanor Vance successfully unwound the most damaging of Peterson's consolidations, restoring my portfolio to a stable, conservative baseline. The $200,000 in the Cayman account was written off as a clinical loss, the cost of obtaining the definitive diagnosis. Space, once a compromise, regained its status as a sanctuary. The locks were changed. The security upgraded, this time by me, based on rational threat assessment, not fabricated paranoia. My files, looted by David, were painstakingly reconstructed where possible. My stolen passport and checkbooks were, of course, canceled and replaced. The physical structure of my life was secured. But the psychological structure required reinforcement. The experience, while validating my diagnostic skills, had exposed a critical vulnerability, the blind spot of paternal hope. I, a psychiatrist, had ignored escalating symptoms in my own son for decades, recategorizing pathological ambition as drive, manipulation as charm, lack of empathy as focus. This realization became the impetus for my new post-retirement work. I did not return to clinical practice. Instead, I channeled my insights into a different form of treatment, education. I began guest lecturing, first at law schools, then at medical schools and financial planning seminars. My topic? The facade of competence, recognizing and countering undue influence and sociopathic manipulation in professional and familial contexts. I used my own case, carefully anonymized, stripped of personal identifiers, presented as a composite case study to illustrate the patterns. The subtle gaslighting, the isolation tactics, the weaponization of grief, the fabrication of medical or legal crises to secure control. I taught lawyers, doctors, and financial advisors, the very professions David, Peterson, and Alcott had corrupted, how to spot the clinical indicators of exploitation. This work felt curative. It transformed my personal trauma into a preventative tool, a diagnostic guide for others. I was, in effect, vaccinating the professional community against the very pathology that had infected my family. Nurse Chapman? I ensured she was more than recognized. I established a small, anonymous grant through a local nursing foundation, specifically designated for recognizing ethical courage and patient advocacy, ensuring she was its first recipient. A quiet, professional acknowledgement of the critical role she played. David remains in prison. He has, thus far, refused all attempts at contact, including my own offers, made through Eleanor, to facilitate discussion. The pathology, it seems, remains firmly entrenched, resistant to insight. He will likely emerge not rehabilitated, but simply older. His file, in my personal archive, is closed but not resolved. A chronic condition, managed by containment. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. My son, a high-functioning sociopath, diagnosed me as senile and incompetent, orchestrating my involuntary commitment to seize control of my assets and cover his own catastrophic failures. He attempted to write the final, fraudulent entry in my life's case file. He failed, because he, the manipulator, fundamentally misjudged his target. He assumed a psychiatrist, grieving and aging, would be a soft target. He forgot that my entire life was dedicated to diagnosing flawed narratives. I didn't just counter his accusations. I applied rigorous diagnostic criteria to his actions, identified the underlying personality disorder, predicted his desperate moves, and prescribed the only effective treatment: immediate, decisive, legal intervention. He tried to have me committed based on a fabricated diagnosis. Instead, I provided the authorities with a real one. The final clinical assessment is his to live with. The prognosis is not good. Thank you for watching Complete Video. Goodbye.